everyone, welcome. Thanks for being here in our first event of EPALF 2020. And EPALF this year looks a lot different, obviously, given the state of the world. And we're really happy and pleased to share this evening with you and to be able to offer this workshop with the Asian American Feminist Collective. And we're super thrilled and excited for this to kick off EPALF this year, which will be focused on resilience, care, and transformation, as there's a lot of healing to be done in the world, and we hope to offer just a little something to support that. So just to give you a sense of who's in the room, you can see other folks in the participant list, but these are the main folks who will be presenting and helping with the back end of things and the planning as well. I'm Candice Kita. I'm the APANO Cultural Strategy Director. B.A. Ogden is going to be our tech and one of the leads for the Resilience series, which this event is a collaboration with the Resilience series, so we're really excited for that as well this year. Misha Belden, also an APANO staff, as well as Roshni Thakur, will be supporting tonight. And then we have 6 folks from the Asian American Feminist Collective and affiliates. So we have Saloni Bauman, Rachel Ko, Senti Sojwal, Sarah Hamid, Mon Mohapatra, and Leila Raven. So welcome them into the space and welcome everyone. So just to get started, if you've been to past events in the Resilience series, you may have seen these before, but in order to create a safe and respectful space for everyone, we start with just some community agreements to make sure that folks feel comfortable and supported as we go through this work together. So this is a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color space only. So if you identify with any of those categories, you're in the right place. And during our time together, please remember to take care of yourself. We're here to connect, but also feel free to turn your video off or do whatever you need to take care of your body. Let's have one person speak at a time and take space and make space. So be mindful of how much you speak, and please be sure to leave space for others to speak as well. In this space, stories can stay, but the lesson can be shared. So when folks are sharing stories in breakout rooms, please keep that confidential, but the larger picture, the big key takeaway or the lesson from that can be shared. Let's respect each other. No one knows everything, but together we know a lot. There's a lot of conversation in this space and a lot of collective wisdom and knowledge. And share gratitude or feedback whenever you feel like it, either in breakout rooms or in the chat. Because we're talking about a lot of pretty complex topics, except non-closure. We're not going to be able to talk about everything related to transformative justice today, but we hope to open the door and plant some seeds. And let's create a space for multiple truths and embrace curiosity. Again, because not anyone here knows everything, but together we have a lot to share. Please keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking, just to minimize background noise. And if you need assistance with Zoom, please don't hesitate to reach out to B, who is our tech and is labeled as tech, I believe, in the participant list. And this is a reminder that this session will be recorded as well. So to ground ourselves in this workshop as well, we would like to provide a land acknowledgement in the digital sphere. We would like to share this acknowledgement from Adrian Wong of the Spiderweb Show. Since our activities are shared digitally on the internet, let's also take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization embedded within the technology, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We're using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art that we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. I know we have folks from many different places in in the United States and maybe even beyond. But we want to also provide just a quick land acknowledgement. Since many of us are zooming in from Oregon, we are currently seated on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Katlamet, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Wasco, Cowlitz, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. And I invite you to join us in acknowledging all of the above as our shared responsibility to make good use of this time and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and accomplishment. We'd also like to share a statement of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And this comes from one of our former APANO colleagues, Jairaj Singh. We also want to acknowledge that our society has deeply rooted within it centuries of white supremacy economies built on the enslavement, the disproportionate imprisonment of Black folks, the violation of human and civil rights, and the concentration of extreme wealth into the hands of a small, mostly white male elite power structure. We explicitly name anti-Blackness as the root of most oppression and racism. We believe this will allow us to be better equipped to dismantle harmful structures and institutions that we are working with and within. So with that bit of grounding, I know that's also a lot, so just let that sink in for our time together today. But for just a quick Zoom related note, please be sure to check how your name is appearing on Zoom. So please be sure to add your pronouns, and you can click on participants and more next to your name to rename yourself. I believe you can also go up to the 3 dots that show up when you hover over your picture on Zoom. And additionally, we also have a little note on video for attendees. If you could take a moment and adjust your video settings, in the bottom corner of your screen, you'll see a video, like a start-stop video button with an arrow next to it. And if you click on the up arrow and select hide non-video participants, that helps us greatly in correctly capturing the recording of tonight's session. So just take a moment to, if you could just take a moment to do those 2 things, that would be really helpful and great. So now I'm really pleased to pass off the mic to our wonderful reps from the Asian American Feminist Collective to share about transformative justice for creatives and artists and cultural workers, and to ask us some questions, to think about how we might be able to support healing, resilience, and transformation for our communities. So without further ado, I will hand it off, and I believe we're going to Senti first.
Yes, thank you so much, Candace. Hi, everybody. My name's Senti Sojwal, and I'm one of the co-leaders of the Asian American Feminist Collective, and I'm here with 2 of my co-leaders, Rachel Kuo and Saloni Bauman. Thank you all so much for spending your evening with us. We're so excited to see all of you here and for you to take part in this really important conversation. I'm sending a lot of love to all of you from Brooklyn. I also want to give a big shout out to APANO, who has been such a dream to organize this event with, so thank you so much. We're so excited to be doing this. So we started AAFC. There are 3 of us who are here today from leadership, and we also have 2 other co-leaders who we work with. And we really came together as a group of activists, scholars, journalists, right after the 2016 election, when we were seeing this huge groundswell of feminist activism after the election of Donald Trump, where we were really seeing a lot of our communities, the Asian American community, really being sidelined from a lot of those conversations. We weren't really seeing as much of what this meant for immigrants, for queer people, for low-income people, for disabled people. And so we started sort of doing a bunch of informal organizing together, and we found that there was really a space that was needed to have these conversations. The response was so immense, and we realized that we were creating something that really should be formalized and that people really wanted space for this kind of identity exploration. And so we launched formally as a collective in 2018. And the work that we do is really centered around engaging in intersectional feminist politics. And for us, Asian American feminism is a world building project. And the beauty of this movement is that we can continue to shape and evolve it. And we really thank you for being part of that evolution and part of this movement by being here with us today. I'm just going to stick in the chat a recent project that we have been involved in over the summer. We wrote an open letter. We want cop-free communities against the creation of an Asian hate crime task force by the NYPD. So I'm just going to share that so folks can read it and get a little bit of a sense of some of the work that we have been involved in lately. And on this slide are all the ways that you can keep in touch with us. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Rachel.
Hi, everyone. So excited to have you all here today. I'm going to quickly go over what our 2 hours together will look like and then offer a brief definition and opening of transformative justice as feminist praxis. So for the first hour, it'll run similarly to a panel conversation. We'll have speakers Leila Raven, Hamid, and Mon Mohapatra, and then some time for Q&A. And then in the second hour, we'll break out into small groups to have a discussion together. And so that'll be what our time looks like together. And then the next slide, please. And so to open up a definition of transformative justice, I want to open with this quote by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Because abolition and transformative justice are intimately linked, I want to start with her provocation. What if abolition isn't a shattering thing, not a crashing thing, not a wrecking ball event? What if abolition is something that sprouts out of the wet places in our eyes, the broken places in our skin, the waiting places in our palms, the tremble holding in my mouth when I turn to you? What if abolition is something that grows? And I think this quote really captures how transformative justice and abolition are linked together, thinking about this idea of how are we growing a community together, right? And so taking a definition of transformative justice by Mia Mingus, which she collectively wrote a definition with, and I'll drop actually the link that this comes from for the full definition for people to read carefully later. But transformative justice is a community-based political framework and approach for responding to violence, harm, and abuse in ways that don't rely on the state, right? So including police, prisons, and ICE, does not reinforce or perpetuate violence, such as oppressive norms or vigilantism, and most importantly, cultivates the things we know prevent violence, such as healing, accountability, resilience, and safety. Right? And so when we think about transformative justice, it really understands our carceral systems of punishment as sites of violence and seeks to build alternatives. And as a feminist politics, transformative justice is really about ending the oppressive conditions such as white supremacy, misogyny, ableism, militarism, and larger systems and conditions that undergird harmful and oppressive dynamics. Right. And so in other words, transformative justice isn't just responding to current incidents of violence as they're happening, but also preventing future violence. And so thinking about how can we respond to violence in ways that not only addresses the current moment, but transform the conditions that allow for it to happen. Or to quote Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Simara Sinha, who I know will also be doing a workshop during EPALF, she's also said, it's non-state approaches to dealing with violence and harm. It's acknowledging that we are in a shitty world working with bad tools, but we are innovative. And so transformative justice practices have been used for generations in big and small scales by communities targeted by the state. It happens at the level of our friendships, our neighborhoods, and this can broaden. Right? And I've been reflecting on this question from this book, Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman, where she says, if a person cannot solve a conflict with a friend, how can they contribute to larger efforts for peace? And I think in many ways, our imaginations and the ways that we imagine our relationships, our futures, our solutions are often sometimes confined, right? Like to our carceral culture, but we can expand beyond that. And so beyond no cops and no prisons, right, we also have a lot of work to do at the level of our communities to undo the internalization of the state and its tactics. such as blaming and shaming, isolating, revenge, and punishment. And we have to really think about what are the values, the practices, and the relationships we want to have in this world that we're building, and how do we build the skills to have healthier relationships and better communication, to heal and to de-escalate, to express ourselves, including our anger, in non-destructive ways. And to kind of close this off, right, like with another quote by Mia Mingus, if violence is collectively enabled, has a collective impact, then it requires a collective response. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our first three speakers for our first hour. I'm really excited to welcome Leila Raven, Mon Mohapatra, and Hamid, who I've gotten to know through our collective work together this summer on 8 to Abolition, and who I've also had the chance to learn so much from. In order of speaking, I'll introduce Leila first. So Leila is an organizer with Hacking and Hustling, a collective of sex workers and survivors working to interrupt state violence. She is the former director of Collective Action for Safe Spaces, a grassroots organization of queer and trans people of color, working to build safety from patriarchal violence without policing. And she'll be talking more on the differentiation between harm and abuse, community safety strategies, and how we take accountability for our everyday lives. Hamid is currently an organizer with the Policing Tech campaign at the Carceral Tech Resistance Network and a board member of CARE Oregon. And she'll be sharing an example from her organizing work here in Oregon, specifically with CARE and legislation on how we respond to hate and violence. And finally, Mon Mohapatra is an artist and organizer who works with Equality Labs and is one of the original conveners of the National No New Jails Network. She'll be expanding on both the challenges and ways to practice accountability in our community by sharing 2 stories of conflict from collectives that she's part of. So thank you all, and I'm really excited to turn it over to Leila.
Hi, y'all. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction and for providing us with that definition and framework. I really especially appreciate Leah's very broad definition of transformative justice. It is every strategy that we use to keep ourselves safe without involving the state, without involving courts, police, and prisons. And I think it's really important to remember that there is no single strategy or tactic that defines transformative justice. There's no right way of doing it. It's a whole toolbox of strategies because just like with other forms of oppressive violence, we need a diversity of tactics for building safety from oppressive violence when it shows up in our everyday lives and our interpersonal relationships. And often when we think about transformative justice, we immediately think about some of the most severe forms of violence like intimate partner abuse and rape. But really we can and need to apply transformative justice strategies to every aspect of our lives and to all of our relationships. It's about building mutual respect, trust, and care for each other, and also recognizing that we're all steeped in this culture where we are bound to internalize the messages of white supremacy, ableism, cis heteropatriarchy, and all the different forms of oppression that shape the world that we live in. And so we're all going to behave in oppressive ways sometimes. And we have to be able to count on the people that we're in relationship with to intervene and interrupt it when we act in oppressive ways. So what I think of most frequently when I think about transformative justice is using bystander intervention when we witness microaggressions. Often we see something and we just don't know what to do or say when we know that something isn't okay. So at CAS, Collective Action for Safe Spaces, which is the grassroots organization that I directed in DC for several years, we would train people in bystander intervention. And so some examples of that are, often you can use a gentle approach. For example, if you know that or have a feeling that the person who said something that was, a microaggression, that they maybe didn't know any better, or they didn't know that what they were saying was a microaggression. Maybe it's somebody you have a close relationship with or family member. You can say something gentle like, I wonder if you realize how that comes across. Or it might need to be more assertive and direct, like, that's not okay, that's disrespectful, that's not going to be tolerated here. And then intervening with these everyday behaviors can create a context where it's clear that those more severe oppressive behaviors won't be tolerated. And it also works to promote the cultural norm that it's the responsibility of everyone in a community to take action to keep each other safe. And so I also want to share strategies briefly for how we can take accountability when we're the ones who've acted in an oppressive way or used a microaggression, because often we just don't know how to apologize. So a few years ago, one of the trainers at CAS and I, Crystal Atha, and I developed a framework for apologizing that we call the 4 A's. And the 4 A's are acknowledge, apologize, ask, and action. So the first one, just acknowledge the harm, acknowledge what you did. And that means like taking responsibility for as much as you can in the moment. Sometimes when we're called in or called out, we're not prepared to apologize in that moment. We're not prepared to take responsibility. We're navigating feelings of defensiveness or guilt or shame. Those are totally normal, but it can be really affirming to someone if we're able to take responsibility for as much as we feel comfortable with in the moment right away. And then maybe we're going to ask for space while we continue to process or talk with other folks and do a gut check. The next one is apologize. Seems pretty straightforward, but there are a lot of ways apologies can go wrong. So to apologize, we want to apologize for what we did, not for the way it was experienced or felt by the person on the receiving end. So you'd say, I'm sorry that I did XYZ, rather than I'm sorry that you felt, I'm sorry that you experienced. So we're taking responsibility for our role in a situation. The next one is ask. So you might want to ask if there are ways to repair the harm. The way that I talk to my 6-year-old about this is, you know, when she ends up in a conflict with another child on the playground, for example, I just tell her to ask, you know, I say I'm sorry, and then ask, is there anything that I can do to make it better? And I think that that's a pretty good and helpful question that we can ask in any time in our lives that we cause harm or hurt someone. And then the last one is action. So if you've just committed to something to do to make it better, follow through. But also action means, you know, changed behavior, because if you're repeating the behavior, then the apology doesn't seem so authentic, right? So action, following through with our actions is like both changing the behavior, correcting the behavior, and taking steps toward repair. But I also want to quickly talk about the distinction between harm and abuse, because I think that especially as transformative justice has become, I think it's more talked about in recent years, and I think that's really wonderful. And at the same time, I think that sometimes the nuance is lost, right? And so we call everything harm. And so for the past few months, I've actually been meeting monthly with a collective of trans and queer survivors of color who've navigated abuse in organizing spaces and have seen the language of transformative justice weaponized to excuse abuse, to dispose of survivors. You know, suddenly the harm is naming what went wrong or naming that you're experiencing abuse. And so it's often survivors or people who have additional needs, like people with disabilities, people who are trans, people who are asking for a safer environment or a more accessible environment are the people who are made to feel like they're the ones who caused harm, right? So some of this language has gotten weaponized as it's become more popular. And so, you know, I want to offer definitions. So BYP 100 has a working definition of harm that I think is pretty helpful. They refer to it as a condition in which a person experiences physical, mental, or emotional pain or anguish, especially which may feel deliberately inflicted. They go on to say that the harm can be rooted in unbalanced power dynamics and systems of oppression, but that's not always the case. Abuse is a repetitive pattern of oppressive, exploitative, and manipulative behavior seeking power and control over another person. Usually it's an intimate partner, but not always. And it's rooted in feelings of entitlement and oppressive values, and it's usually masked with lies. So having a conversation directly with somebody who is actively engaging in abusive behaviors usually doesn't work. Maybe they'll apologize and then do the same thing again. And so, I think that also speaks to, and I think consequences are important, whether it is harm or abuse, but I think particularly with abuse, that speaks to the important role of consequences. As we work to build a culture that is not rooted in punishment, we can't, that doesn't mean that we are pretending everything is okay when harm and abuse happen. Things need to change. Often the status quo needs to change. And so TJ is not always about like people holding hands and living happily ever after. While there are many instances when people are engaging in oppressive behaviors and just need to be corrected with, a bystander intervention strategy or a conversation, there are also instances where people are demonstrating no accountability and no changed behavior. And often people don't change behaviors until they've experienced consequences for their actions. And when their actions are condoned or even rewarded by the dominant oppressive culture, they'll learn through reinforcement that what they're doing is okay. It's working for them, it's benefiting them. And so there's no real reason to change. And in fact, changing behaviors comes at a greater cost. So when we're actively working to create an anti-oppressive environment, we have to create consequences for oppressive behaviors that won't naturally occur in the context of systemic oppression. And then I wanted to offer an example, but actually, how am I doing on time? Am I a little over? Am I good?
You're perfect on time. You have plenty.
Okay, great. So then I'll talk a little bit about my recent experience. Some of you may have heard about the magazine, Commune Magazine, that shut down in May. It was short-lived, but I recently put together a zine about the experience I had with the Commune Magazine Collective that led to that shutdown. And it all started, last October. I was assaulted by one of the Commune Collective editors. There were multiple attempts at private interventions in November. The person apologized, I assumed good faith, and then the person assaulted me a second time. And so, during that time period, I found myself ending up back into this cycle of abuse. And I ended up organizing my community. We had a very effective Twitter campaign calling for his removal as editor, leaving his name and my name anonymous initially. And we offered an invitation to participate in a community accountability process, which I think is the main thing that people think about when they think of transformative justice. These like long, sometimes 2-year-long circles where there's a support team, an accountability team, and each party is being supported in moving towards healing, safety, and accountability. And in this process, my support team and I saw a lot of the same behaviors, except what was worse was the Commune Collective members that were on the abusers accountability team were also perpetuating those same behaviors and also using the process to sort of enable and perpetuate abuse. And at the same time, we were hearing about abuses by other Commune Collective editors after the call out, because once one story comes out, other people start feeling safer sharing their own stories. And so after this nightmare of a process, I said, okay, the accountability process ended up being an extension of the abuse. And it was a reminder that, just like the Mingus quote that Rachel shared earlier, like abuse and violence is not an individual problem, it's a collective problem, and we need collective solutions. And so also collective consequences. After that process, I learned that my abuser had been abusive to someone else who had been in the collective. That person left and returned after I organized for his removal. And so the abusive behavior had not only been perpetuated and enabled in the process, but also within the collective. So I asked them, the other folks in the collective, I ended the process and said, how about you all as a collective reflect on what are the ways that you can prevent future incidents like this from happening? What are the processes you can build in your collective to prevent future incidents of violence? And I thought that that was a pretty strong ask. It was going to leave me with like a happy ending. And I got an email from a Proton Mail email account saying Commune Magazine was never involved in this process. It wasn't signed by anyone. And so, you know, in the end, and that they were going to disengage. So they were ending communication with me. And so at that point, it had been months later, it was pretty clear that they had used the process basically just to like shut me up. The whole time I was anonymous. And so it was almost as if the accountability process was just being used to sweep the whole thing under the rug. And so again, I turned back to my community, shared what happened, and our community-based anti-carceral response needed to deliver graduated consequences. So I rallied my support team again, and we were able to organize to effectively shut down Commune Magazine through like just organizing, community organizing, and social media. So I share that example in part to show, you know, like often these strategies, they don't always work, and we have to turn to other tools. And especially when we're dealing with abuse, community organizing can help shift power dynamics. Abuse is about, like I said earlier, power and control. And so we can't always just like, you know, you wouldn't talk to Trump supporters and be like, hey, wouldn't you rather not? Like, it doesn't always work. We have to move forward and also remember the role of consequences as we build alternatives to policing and punishment. So yeah, let's see. Making the distinction between harm and abuse, I think, like I said, it just allows us to respond accordingly. And like I said earlier too, like a diversity of tactics for responding to abuse can include so many things. It can be physically fighting back. It could be a circle process, seeking accountability, a public call for accountability, organizing, focusing on our healing. Those are all different strategies that we can use to build safety. And the last thing that I wanted to share too was just, you know, sometimes our community-based anti-carceral strategies involve physical violence. And this is why I really appreciate the work of Survived and Punished in this area. You know, there are so many instances, and you know, I've also had this experience where I was in an abusive situation, grabbed a knife, and ended up being arrested with my abuser. This was like 8 years ago now. So many instances where we're fighting back against oppressive violence, and we are criminalized for our responses, or even shamed for our responses by communities, even abolitionist communities. And so I just wanted to affirm quickly that, you know, sometimes we do use vigilantism or physical violence in response. And I think the difference between like violence and self-defense is, you know, is the tactic being used to maintain oppression, or is it being used to disrupt the status quo? So yeah, so I hope that was helpful. Just to recap, I shared about how we can intervene and interrupt harm and oppressive behaviors in our everyday lives, how we can take accountability, and some thoughts on when the situation is messier than using bystander intervention tactics, or just being able to say, I'm sorry, because we have to remember, like Rachel said earlier, acts of violence like rape and intimate partner abuse don't happen in a vacuum. They aren't individual problems, they're whole community problems, and we need whole communities involved in the project of building safety and accountability. And with that, I will turn it over to my comrade and friend, Sarah, who's going to talk more about community safety strategies.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel, Leila, and the APANO community. It's really nice to share space with you tonight. So I'm not a TJ practitioner by training, but I have been very fortunate in my life and in my organizing to have amazing mentors, some of who are on this call, to teach me a lot. And so I'm going to ground some of the concepts that Rachel and Leila talked about today in an Oregon context. So the architecture of transformative justice is often broken down into 3 domains of work: The first is healing and reparative work directed at the survivor, often in relationship to or in confrontation against the abuser. The second is community accountability, which diagnoses and confronts the inability for a community of individuals to ensure safety. And the third is community amelioration, to disrupt those conditions and build towards harm prevention. I think both Rachel and Leila have done an incredible job describing and adding texture to the first domain. And I want to spend some time with the second and also a different scale of violence. So first, state justice versus community justice. The scale of transformative justice is often at the level of individuals, and it's considered to be work that's done with regard to individual abusers, individual survivors, individual events that repeat and form a pattern, however episodic. And I don't think that's because transformative justice is inadequate. I think it's because it's also creative work. It's necessarily work that is creating worlds as it's being done. Sarah Schulman's work was brought up earlier, and I think one of the most important takeaways for me for that book was the realization that we are immersed in a culture of justice and punishment, which has its terms defined for it already by the state, by its institutions, its logics, and its practices. And when that state has a white supremacist inheritance, a genocidal inheritance, it's not just that those logics are inadequate to deal with harm, sometimes they're just downright dangerous. So when we confront situations of harm, our understanding of what is happening to us, what's happening to our loved ones, and those who we are in community with are often over-determined by the state's way of thinking. And so, for instance, in an Anglo-American state that has a Pax Romana it inherits, it relies on concepts like individual guilt, like deterrence through spectacle, and the punishing of individuals as a vehicle for social order. So concepts like collective guilt is incommensurable with this culture of justice and punishment. And that's why it's nearly impossible to find accountability or reparation for structural harms in our current punitive systems, especially when those harms span multiple institutions and generations. So it makes sense then how we understand justice today is overdetermined by this system, and why it's hard then to scale transformative justice to meet violence that's at scale, because we aren't just talking about new or different practices of accountability. We're also building entirely new languages and vocabularies and ways of making sense of what harm is, why harm is, how harm is. We're literally creating a new kind of justice, and that work is slow, and it has to undo a lot of deep entrenched thinking. So that's why I like to sit with the second of these three domains I mentioned earlier, because sometimes we can't point to an abuser, or sometimes the abuse that's being enacted or animated is being done by more than one individual. And not only is it being done by more than one individual, the carceral state is hell-bent on you identifying an individual for them to pillory, regardless of what it costs your community to do so. Second, white supremacist violence in Oregon versus community safety. So in Oregon, we've been in the unique crosshairs of white supremacist fascist communities who are empowered to harm BIPOC communities by first, the blatant white supremacist history of the state, and second, the specific political cultures that are prevalent in the Pacific Northwest that protect speech, free association, and Second Amendment privileges. So I want to be specific and intentional about how I articulated that, because that's not how I've always described this problem. There was a time not very long ago when I described this problem as, in Oregon, we have white supremacists who target and terrorize BIPOC communities. Notice how in the second way of articulating that problem, blame is articulated, and how even in the language, I'm looking for an individual to designate as guilty and deserving of carceral retribution. That kind of individuation of guilt, if we can see to it, has broad consequences for the kind of justice we can and cannot achieve. And it has consequences for the kind of safety and care creating practices we admit ourselves into. So for many in Oregon BIPOC communities, the urgent need in recent history has been to find safety from targeted harassment and violence by white supremacists. This need brought together a wide coalition of folks who came out in support of SB 577 last year, one of the most comprehensive pieces of hate crime legislation that was enacted in the country. Oregon's hate crime bill made violence or the threat of violence a felony based on the survivor's membership into a protected class, and it expanded the category of protected class to include gender. The state DOJ also created a hate crimes response coordinator so that survivors who feel that incidents of harm do not rise to the standard of hate crime that can be prosecuted can call a hotline and essentially inform and inform the police about the incident and offer the state information on the incident. So SB 577 mandates that law enforcement entities improve documentation, read surveillance of this entire spectrum of incidents, and it's created a statewide ticker in which Oregonians are now allowed to track in real time the DOJ's hate crime caseload, who is prosecuted, who is convicted, the sentences issued, and the rates of recidivism. So CARE Oregon, which was a leading advocate of SB 577, I wasn't part of the organization during that fight, but one of the reasons why it was an advocate was that it was responding to a Muslim community which felt itself increasingly targeted by racially hostile violence. And it put a tremendous amount of faith in the state. This summer, however, it became obvious why right-wing militias felt empowered to target the Muslim community. These militias were in coalition and community with local and state law enforcement. That makes these incidents more than individuals who are roused to violence because of racial animus. That effectively makes these incidents, some of which have been lethal, extrajudicial murder. So let's gather our terms here. If transformative justice is the work of building new models of justice, accountability, and harm repair practices, and those practices attend to the root conditions of violence and harm, how do we make sense of justice in the context of state-sanctioned and scaled violence perpetrated by those that we're not in community with? Is it even useful to use transformative justice in this model? I'd argue yes, and that's because of domain 2, community accountability. Community accountability isn't just about reallocating individual guilt that's mandated by the state. It's about, as Leila beautifully explained, building an ethics of community obligation and responsibility to one another. We keep each other safe. That's not just a mandate to care for one another's safety. It's a mandate to recognize that there's a shared obligation to ensure safety. So I want to talk a little bit about doxing and what it means to build collective responsibility for safety. So what does this collective responsibility look like, and how do we scale transformative justice processes? 2 weeks ago, Oregon lawmakers announced that they were working on a pair of bills for the 2021 legislative session that criminalized doxing, which, as folks who are from Oregon are well aware, is a tactic that's utilized by white supremacist organizations. For anyone who's been involved in this year's street movements or connected to someone who has, we're also aware that doxing is not just a tactic that's used by the PPB or Andy Ngo. It's also by the Proud Boys or Andy Ngo. It's also a tactic that the Portland Police Bureau uses to enroll the Proud Boys to do the work of intimidating protesters on their behalf. These bills would make it a misdemeanor to post individuals' private or identifying information online. There'd be an almost $7,000 fine, and if the doxer has a prior conviction, they could be charged with a Class C felony. So now, in the time between the announcement of this bill and this workshop, there have already been 3 serious doxing incidents within the CARE community alone. So it's not just that the levers of carceral injustice are slow, it's that they're useless here. Criminalizing individual doxers is a meaningless gesture when what you're up against is effectively extrajudicial doxing by the PPB. So right now, our community needs immediate safety, and there needs to be a collective responsibility built around that need for safety. So practices of transformative justice around safety means first, rejecting the individuation of guilt logics, and rejecting that it's remembering that doxing is sometimes used in the case of interpersonal harm, as in the case with abusive ex-partner, although even in this case, it's reinforced by law enforcement practices, but we need to reject it enough so there's a room to be opening to create new languages to understand doxing, the harm it creates, and the individual vulnerabilities and structures that make that possible. And our second obligation is collectivizing our sense of responsibility for safety. This is especially true in the case of doxing, because doxing happens in part because of the network relationship of our communication technologies. Digital safety practices then become community safety practices. So part of our work now in the CARE Oregon community is to return to and a workshop with our community members to innovate around these two directives. So we've been leading forum style discussions, and we've come up with 5 tentative action items that we can take and directions that we can take. And I just wanted to share them with you. These are still very much works in progress, and these are conversations that we're having that's ongoing. So the first is normalizing protest safety, because digital hygiene habits like that put your own device at risk when you're at protests. They put any device that you're connected to at risk, and doing things like streaming protests for clout literally gets people killed. Second is pooling resources for safe internet access and prioritizing that as an organizational mandate, which means that oftentimes you have to make trade-off because having a VPN service is expensive. And so having those conversations within your organization. Third is having frank and honest conversations about the trade-off between brand building and celebrity and authenticity and community privacy and safety, because trade-offs have to be made there too. And sometimes we need to prioritize anonymity in order to make sure that our community is safe. Fourth is pooling resources when community members are targeted. It's extremely labor intensive to scrub an online identity or to rapidly respond to a doxing situation when it happens. And so making sure that there's a triage plan in action where community members feel safe and they know that there are places that they can go when they feel as though their address, for instance, has been revealed to the public. And finally, taking on the work of being present for and behalf of community members who survived doxing. It's a extremely disorienting event. I'm not sure if this has happened to anyone on the call. And so knowing that you have folks that you can trust, a network that you can activate, and knowing that folks will do things like, for instance, come online and defend your reputation. So both CTRN and Care Oregon are in early days of thinking through these practices, but I wanted to share how transformative justice can inform that conversation, and does in this case, and how it's also creative work, it's brainstorming work, it's workshopping these kinds of concepts, and it's difficult work, but it's really, really elegant too, because it's, like I said, literally the practice of world making. Thank you. I'm going to hand it off to Mon now.
That was amazing. Thank you. I am constantly amazed by Leila and Sarah. And so thankful to all of you for being here with us. So I think Rachel kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to be looking at 2 kind of case studies of intra-community conflict that I have been situations in, and thinking about how to tie some of what Leila was saying in terms of strategies around how we can actually keep each other safe, and distinctions that we need to make around harm and abuse, and then what Sarah's offering, which was so many things, but specifically around all the experiments we need to do in order to practice transformative justice, in order to reject the kinds of justice formations and justice systems that we've been taught. So thanks again for all these learnings. I think that the points that Leila made around the importance of consequences have been so important to me, and I've learned so much from them. And that we need to build the systems that allow for us to take accountability in our communities and allow for there to be consequences is a critical part of how we actually shape those communities. And then thinking about what Sarah said, the kinds of transformative justice practices we build have to refuse to perpetuate systemic harms. So I want to visit 2 experiences of my own in bridging these 2 useful and connective bodies of lessons around transformative justice. And I have to preface this with the fact that while I embrace, support, learn, and use transformative justice and harm reduction skills in my everyday life, as everyone should, I am not a transformative justice practitioner, which is a role unto itself, like mediator or counselor. I think it's important to say that so that we don't minimize the work, effort, and energy it takes to actually manage and facilitate accountability processes, big and small. And something that I'm actually going to return to at the end of my short talk, where I just want to really emphasize how important it is to have people who actually hold these skills, because as important as it is for all of us to be thinking about them, it's really necessary that we have people who actually can do the work. So the experiences. So the first was when I had recently moved to New York. That was about 6 years ago, and I became part of a collective known as the South Asian Diaspora Arts Collective. And I joined the group to be able to learn and organize alongside other South Asian artists. And I was much younger. And about a year into the group's existence, we were handling different kinds of conflict, and we were also anticipating different kinds of conflict. So we were handling conflict, and we were also anticipating things that could emerge down the line. So for example, we had a table at another group's event where someone who was in our close community had to interact with their abuser, and they didn't know that they would have to do that. She was understandably upset, and it also forced all of us who were kind of part of the leadership of the group to think about how we were actually taking care of our communities in the space that we were parts of. There were other kinds of conflict too. For example, when we did an event and people felt that some of the performance had been anti-Black, there was someone who was misgendered over the course of on an email over the course of a year. And then in the months that followed, the series of events we had, after those events, we actually had a bunch of brainstorming sessions and calls to think about how we could do better. But we were ultimately totally derailed by even the prospect of conflict because we couldn't imagine how to do this together. So the lack of skills, the lack of political education, and the lack of anticipation around the fact that conflict would emerge meant that when it finally did happen, and when we were trying to think about what else could go wrong, we just weren't prepared to handle it. And we also hadn't had no one tell us, oh, this is all the ways that you can actually do this without relying on the state or relying on police. So looking back, it would have required trust and patience and commitment from all of us to design the principles and agreements and accountability systems necessary for a collective to work together, especially a collective that included so many different people from so many different backgrounds, who all had very complicated histories of trauma with each other, even if they weren't interpersonal traumas. And I feel like that point is especially important because one of the things that we didn't do when we started South Asian Diaspora Arts Initiative is we thought, let's just bring all of these people into the room. We'll all be artists. We'll all talk about these things. And what ultimately happened was that we had people who were Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan. There were people who were Indo-Caribbean, people with very different backgrounds, people with class and caste differences, people who, it wasn't that there were even people who were harassing each other, because even though that was some of the conflict, it was really that there were people who were coming into the space with art. We were coming together to celebrate art and look at art, and art is such a politicized thing, especially in spaces that want to shift from supremacist ideas of art. So the fact that we didn't actually acknowledge that at the beginning was, I think, an oversight, but also a testament to the fact that this isn't these are not skills that everybody has. And we are, at the time, we were really thinking, and we were taught to think that there were only certain ways that these conflicts could be resolved. So one thing that actually happened in that situation was that my friend, who was also in the group with me, came to me and he was like, I really don't want to ever have these things happen. I want to be able to know how to handle these conflicts. But the anxiety that he ultimately had around being unable to do that was one of the things that actually led to the end of the group. So, but for the most part, I think with Sadak, it was really what happens, when you're trying to prepare, but you don't have the skills or you don't know what to prepare for. And then the second kind of case study is more about when the violence does happen. So the second case study I wanted to share is about No New Jails, New York City, a campaign to stop the construction of 4 new jails in New York City that ran from September 2018 to May 2020, ultimately ending due to intergroup conflict and abuse. There were so many dynamics in the core part of the campaign, including that not enough time had been spent on building trust, doing political education, creating shared agreements, and figuring out what we would do if harm occurred. On top of that, eventually we learned that people within the core group had been abused by other people in the group. One of the big things I learned as a result of this was that the patterns of misogyny and anti-Blackness that resulted in abuse within our group mirrored the same patterns of misogyny and abuse and ableism and anti-Blackness that we saw in the prison industrial complex we wanted to end. This meant that unless we did the work to protect each other both preemptively and after the harms occurred, we were never going to be able to take those systems down, which is something I think both Leila and Sarah kind of were getting at, which is that here we were trying to address these systems, but we had not actually done the work to like address the way that they were showing up in our intergroup dynamics, which I think happened with SADC as well. And so here we have two groups that I was part of that were ultimately ended through an inability to address future conflict or a failure to recognize ongoing ones. SADC was a group that essentially, that's the South Asian Diaspora Arts Collective, was a group that essentially did not have the time, at the time, the skills or analysis to develop accountability systems, or even that such a thing could exist and deal with the things that we thought were so awful. Like, how could we do that ourselves? And with No New Jails, there were multiple instances of harm that arose from a lack of consensus, a lack of safety practices, shared principles that manifested in conflict aversion and led to people in our community being materially and tangibly harmed in ways that we now need to account for. So how do these connect to what, on a large scale, to what Sarah and Leila is saying, in my opinion? For one, that I think that it's that the patterns of abuse we see in our communities often reflect the unequal power dynamics of the systems we're taking on. This is something I think occurred really intensely with No New Jails. But whether it's doxing or patriarchal violence, people who harm others are often empowered by systems that themselves replicate that harm on a much larger scale. So another way of saying this is white supremacist and carceral systems like detention centers, prison industrial complex, institutionalization are not going to be able to hold white supremacists accountable or deliver them consequences for doxing activists of color. Particularly activists who are trying to dismantle those systems because it's not in the interest of those carceral and white supremacist systems. Black, poor, trans, queer, disabled people who use drugs and who are sex working face institutional systemic abuse in ways that gets replicated in social and political formations, both as harm and as abuse. So when patriarchal violence occurred within No New Jails and we failed to do anything about it, it undermined our ability to organize against the jail expansion. And as Leila is saying, it would have been critical, and it was critical, and it will be critical to have community safety strategies, principles, agreements, and consequences, and to have language that joined our commitment to ending the prison industrial complex to our commitment to community care. And I also think that this resonates with what Sarah's offered, because asking these questions and setting boundaries without asking these questions and without setting boundaries, without weaving community care and transformative justice practice into our practices of being social, we risk accepting solutions that expand the systems that are also going to harm us or others we love. So, for example, bills that seek to criminalize an act rather than abolish the systems that produce it. It's important for us to have an orientation towards how we will keep activists safe from being doxxed without relying on systems of criminalization that produce fascist strategies like doxing in the first place. If that seems a bit tenuous, I can draw it out. Doxing, for example, became popular for cis men as a way of harassing women who were gamers. Okay, it was also a form of patriarchal violence. Police, as a group with higher rates of domestic violence and murder of queer and trans people, just for example, along with a lot of other kinds of violence, also engage in patriarchal violence. If patriarchy is at the root of both, leveraging police to stop doxing is a zero-sum solution. It's just like they're not going to cancel each other out. Similarly, for us in SADC, it was this anxiety around, what do we do if we don't use police? If we use police, well, how could we fix these things that we only know how to fix with police that ultimately ended our collective? So I just want to return to this, what I was saying about, I'm not a transformative justice practitioner. And I think that's why transformative justice practitioners, teachers, workshops, and trainings are so important, because not only is transformative justice something that we need to learn and embody, but forming accountable communities, so building those structures, which can take a lot of work, time, and trust, has to be intentional. And I don't want to romanticize it either. Not all kinds of violence can be addressed with transformative justice. And I think Leila got at this too. But within an abolitionist framework, it can move us to commit to ways of addressing harm and abuse without utilizing carceral systems. At the end of the day, if you care about a collective or group that you're a part of, then you have to grapple with difficult questions like what happens if one of us hurts another person? This is something that I think could have changed Sadaq's fate, and I think could have actually really made a critical intervention in stopping the abuse that was happening within no new jails. We all know, I think, that conflict will happen, and no space, not a politicized space, not a social space, not a learning space, is exempt from the kinds of dynamics that we know control our lives. But holding the line around what's acceptable, I think, as Rachel, Sarah, and Leila said, and adopting and experimenting with a variety of community care and safety strategies are how we can try to navigate these dynamics. And just like my last kind of parting thought is that transformative justice, the reason I say that transformative justice is not going to be able to address all kinds of violence is because it's just one strategy out of others. I think something that we're all kind of getting at in our talks is that these are commitments to trying to address harm and violence without resorting to systems of criminalization and punishment, which means that they're also about a commitment to experimentation and care that has to be intentional. So that was the end of what I had to say, but I also am about to transition us into the Q&A. So I would love to open it up to people who have questions.
There's actually some in the chat, and we'll have some shorter Q&A and then transition into breakouts to continue processing the things that are emerging in this panel. So I'll read the first one from Lynn. What are the alternatives if law enforcement are not there? Is there another name to go for accountability enforcement? And so it seems like maybe we can have a question of like, how do we uphold accountability collectively, right? Like that isn't about systems of force, because I think throughout the time it's like, well, what if, right? Like abusers and perpetrators do not want to be held in accountability. So what do we do there? And if anybody wants to take that question.
Yeah, I think it's a lot like what Mon was saying, that it's in all of our collectives, in all of our communities, we build processes for dealing with harm that we know will inevitably occur. You know, it'll definitely happen, harm will happen, conflict will happen. So before it does, we can come up with like, what are our shared values? What are our agreed upon ways of working together, agreed upon ways of making decisions? What do we do if there's a conflict? Do we have a budget for mediation if conflict arises? And what do we do if it's abuse? And I think, you know, outlining that from the get-go is a way of cultivating a safer environment, and then revisiting it. You know, you don't, I think so often, so many organizations that have definitely been in so many organizations where we have done this. I'm part of the problem where, you know, we write all these processes, we have this day-long retreat, and then you never look at that sheet of paper again. And so I think that a lot of groups now are working on like, you know, how do we stay accountable to these agreements that we've made? How do we come back to this? And I think that's a work in progress.
I also, I mean, I think something that both Sarah and Leila got at was like this idea, like not all conflict and harm that occur are at the same scale. So like the kinds like, you know, like white militant fascists like attacking people on an institutional scale is very different from like what happens when we're in communities together. So I feel like I'm especially grateful and supportive from the learning that I've gotten from AFC and also from Leila around like recognizing that you probably shouldn't even build a group or a community or a collective if you're not going to address, like if you're not going to be intentional about harm in the first place. Like what's even the point? And then the second kind of thought that I had to that question is that I think they asked, like, is there another name to go for accountability enforcement to avoid evildoers? And I think that's a really interesting question that I don't have an answer for, because law enforcement is moot, because the law is like moot, because the law is a racist concept. And so I think something that we're all kind of thinking through together is like, what is the name for all these strategies? But one kind of framework that I've appreciated is like critical interventions, which I think is just a great framework for talking about it.
Thanks, Mon. Sushmita, I saw a raised hand if you wanted to ask your question. And like we can tie that question in with maybe with Kelly's, who wants to know, right? I think Mon, you did address this like around like organizations around like sharing values. So I think that question might have been addressed, but if not, we can move that question to the breakout group. But Sushmita, if you wanted to ask yours, and then after this question, we'll transition into breakouts.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everyone. This is so amazing. I love all of these spaces that we have. My question, there are two parts to it. One, when all of the rooms that I have been to, discussions and communication that I've been to with leadership, when the leadership themselves do not even understand what policing means, what law enforcement means, what abolishment means, how are they ever going to welcome the idea? Because it's like I have a feeling that we will keep asking for this. We will do all of the work for years and years, and we'll keep asking and banging our head against a wall, but it's not going to go anywhere because they themselves, their upbringing, circumstances, friend circle do not embrace it. Second, the other set of rooms that I've been to as a civic leader is with community. And constantly, it seems to me that people do not even know what this idea is about and what it can potentially look like. I know it's a new idea for people, but how do we, as groups, as leaders, as organizations, really go grassroots and communicate with people what this can potentially mean and look like? Thanks.
And to summarize that question, I think it could be helpful to kind of think about what I'm also hearing is like how we mobilize like these languages and learnings around abolition and transformative justice to broader community spaces, right? Like where they may not be as accessible. So
Yes,
if anybody
because,
wants to take that question.
I'll add one little thing to that. It's like when people themselves do not even realize the harm that is being done to them. If the community doesn't realize the harm that's happening, how are they going to become advocates and ambassadors for the change and be part of the system that changes everything?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big challenges that I think many of us have run into over the past year, that even if the community has the language for talking about the harm, that when it actually comes up, it gets twisted so that naming the harm is the harm. It's easier to push out people who have been harmed than it is to deal with the difficult dynamics that have led to harm. And so I think that it's an ongoing challenge. I think that education is one piece, training, just like Mon was saying earlier, but another piece is recognizing that there are power dynamics and sometimes you have to just mobilize. So with No New Jails and also with Commune Magazine, in so many of our experiences, we said, okay, we brought the situation to the community, and the community either didn't believe us, tried to bad jacket us, tried to harm us further. The community didn't deal with it appropriately. And so then we brought it to the larger community and said, hey, look at what's happening here. And often, unfortunately, it's easier to point elsewhere and see very clearly when you've got like a bird's eye view. oh yeah, that's definitely like abusive, like that's definitely harm. But when you're in it, it's so much harder to recognize and so much harder to believe that, you know, my friend was assaulted or my friend experienced this problem. And so I think it's just an ongoing challenge. But ongoing political education for groups on how to recognize oppressive behaviors is important, and also remembering that even that sometimes won't work, probably because of power dynamics. Usually the people who are engaging in those oppressive behaviors are people who hold power within a collective or within an organization or within a community, whether that's like celebrity status or they hold a lot of relationships. And so sometimes you have to turn to organizing or turn to a larger community.
And hi, everyone. My name is Saloni. I'm just kind of hopping in here really quickly before we transition to small groups. But Sushmita, what I really hear you saying is something that Leila mentioned earlier and Rachel talked about too, is I think when you're trying to deal with an organization where there isn't a shared sense of committing to a certain kind of way of dealing with problems, it can feel very vulnerable to be the person to name something as harm. And there are all of these ways that things that we do to actually gather power and organize power are coded as somehow irresponsible or transgressive or gossipy. You know, I think that there are these things like talking to other people in your organization about someone else in your organization is frowned upon. But often that's the way that you learn to feel affirmed that your experience was real and worth addressing, right? And so I think it's only in that like super grassroots wherever you are is basically talking to the people who also know the circumstances of what you're immediately experiencing, coming up with a proposed solution that makes sense for that space, and attempting to do it that way first. And I think Leila Zine, I really kind of recommend checking it out because it's so, one, brave, and two, I so admired the way that you kind of were consistent in both your values and in saying that you are owed a certain kind of accountability, even if denied over and over. And I think that in that insistence, you actually do get to redefine what a justice or a just outcome is for someone, right? Because it'll look different for everyone. I'm a little rambly, but those are just some thoughts. I really do think that we're disincentivized from speaking to each other to kind of like come up with what we feel happened to us and how to appropriately deal with it. And it can feel really transgressive to do as little as like share your salary. So speaking about someone who's assaulted you or harassed you can feel like you're actually hurting that person more than you are addressing your own thing. And I think the more we are comfortable building power amongst each other or among kind of like-minded individuals, even in an organization that has not fully changed, that's kind of the first step anyway. I'm also wondering if this might be a good time for us to break into our little breakout groups and we can all talk about experiences that we've had and, you know, bring it a little closer to home. Great.
Saloni, for that. If we could just pull up the breakout room slide, that would be amazing. So we can just see some of the questions that will be on offer. So there'll be an opportunity to reflect and process and how you're connecting personally, either from your creative practice or your political or like experiences in your collectives, like to this conversation. And then we'll have some time to talk about responding to harm and conflict, and then kind of imagine other infrastructures and skills. And so we'll break out into groups and each of us will be facilitating and rebuilding that space, and just want to put out a reminder again about the community agreements that were raised at the beginning. And we'll have 30 minutes in our groups and then come back together at 6:40, at 9, sorry, I'm like looking at my East Coast time zone, 6:45 for debrief. So see you all soon.